Israel get away with it. Now here I think it's very important for us to see the role that Israel thinks it has in terms of the world economy and the world imperial project. In the 1950s, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz used a phrase. It said that Israel should be the watchdog state for the Western imperial countries in the Middle East. The watchdog state. What they meant by that is actually tied up in the history of Zionism. From its very beginning, at the end of the 19th century, Zionism, as a political philosophy of Jewish nationalism, and Zionism therefore is quite different and separate from Judaism as a religion, but Zionism as a political philosophy, touted itself around all the major imperial powers to see who would give it support for a Jewish nation. And it wasn't the case that from the very beginning, they thought that that nation was going to be in the Middle East. The most famous example of it not being in the Middle East is when they tried to make a deal to have a Jewish homeland in the north of Argentina. And it led to migration of people from Europe to the north, and they were called the Gaucho Judeas, so the Jewish cowboys. They ended up in the north of Argentina as cowboys, but trying to establish a Jewish state. It was a short-lived project. It didn't take off, but it wasn't originally necessary for the Zionist project that their land had to be in the Middle East. It was really only with the development of Britain and French interest in the Middle East that Zionism tagged itself onto the notion that its ancient homeland in Israel should be part of that project. And that means that when we look at the history of this, we have to see that the French regime and the British government were absolutely central to the establishment of the State of Israel. The Balfour Agreement in 1917, the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916 between France and Britain, which carved up the old Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War. These are at the heart of recognition for the Jewish entity, the Jewish state, the Israeli state at the end of the Second World War. But by the watchdog state, what the Zionists were saying essentially was this, that we have only ever managed to create our state and to survive by siding with imperialism, by being a West European nationalist project wherever we find ourselves placed. And that means that we are part of that West European ideology of empire, a colonial settler state in the Middle East that represents the interests of Western imperialism. So it means that the Israeli state from the beginning has looked towards the major imperial powers for its support, willing to go into bed with any of them in the early days, France or Britain, even Russia for an early time, and then focusing on America. And what they've offered as the watchdog state essentially is this. It seems to me that what they've said is that in return for munitions and arms, in return for civil support and benefits, that Israel will become, in essence, a large aircraft carrier in the Middle East for the American military project. I think that's how you can see Israel. They're like an aircraft carrier in that part of the world who represents the interests of American imperialism. And if you want to think what that means in concrete terms, think of what happened 2 years ago in 2006. In 2006, Israel attacks Lebanon. Why did they attack Lebanon? Well, at the time, this was an attack on Hezbollah. Why was it an attack on Hezbollah? Because the American state at that time was losing the war in Iraq. The argument was that the reason they were losing the war in Iraq was because of Muqtada Saddam's army, that Muqtada Saddam's army were being financed by Iran, that Iran and Syria financed both Muqtada Saddam's army and Hezbollah, and therefore the way to break that chain and change the forces in Iraq was to deal a blow against Hezbollah in Lebanon. But America couldn't do that. America was stretched in Iraq and was fighting in Afghanistan and couldn't have the support at home because of the anti-war movement to get into Lebanon, and so they unleashed their watchdog state to carry it out for them. Whenever American interests, oil interests, imperial interests, political interests are threatened in that part of the world, Israel is the one who's let off the leash to go and deal with it. Obviously they have their own interests that coincide with those, but that represents the general imperial interest at that part of the world. So I think that what they are is, in fact, a watchdog state for empire. And in return for being a well-armed, well-trained military regime who will go into these countries and carry out these attacks, they continue to be financed in that way. They are the fourth biggest army in the world. They receive more military support from America than any other regime in the world. They receive more civilian aid from America than any other country in the world. So if you think about aid that goes from America and it would go to solve impoverishment. You might think that that would be diverted to Africa, perhaps India, or Burma, or Sri Lanka, or after the tsunami, perhaps somewhere else in that part of the world. But no, actually, it goes to Israel. And it means that in terms of per capita support, how much the American state provides per head of the Israeli population, it provides more for the welfare of Israeli citizens than it does for its own citizens in, for example, West Central LA. So the black population in West Central LA get nothing from the American state, but Israeli citizens get vast handouts to have a welfare system to support them. So it means that America provides both welfare systems, that kind of support, as well as the military support at the same time. So it gets that in return for being that watchdog state. For whenever America wants that to happen, it's unleashed in that way. But if that's the case, then I think both 2006 and what is happening in Gaza pose a certain problem for Israel. And the problem essentially is this: that up until 2006, if we think of all what's sometimes called the Israeli-Arab wars, the reason that Israel continued to get the support of the Americans was because they won those wars. They were a very ideologically motivated army, they had the best arms in the region, and they could carry out whatever acts America or were in American interest. They could deal with Syria, they could deal with Egypt, they could deal with Lebanon, and therefore they reasserted themselves as the local imperial proxy for America. But if you think about 2006, suddenly they come up against Hezbollah and they lost that war. Hezbollah, if it was just in terms of the weight of weapons, Israel should have been able to smash Hezbollah. But the problem is that wars are not just fought with the amount of weapons you have at your disposal. If you think about it in terms of the Vietnam War, in Vietnam, America, the biggest military power in the world, took on North Vietnam, a peasant-based army. If it was just about the weight of arms that you had at your disposal, there would be a no contest, America would win, except America didn't win. Vietnam won. The reason that Vietnam won was because war is made up of two things. It's the weapons that you have at your disposal, but it's also about how committed you are ideologically to the fight, how you take that on, how you explain the world, how determined you are in your fighting process. And so the North Vietnamese army was ideologically driven, the South Vietnamese forces were ideologically driven, they wanted to get rid of America, they wanted a free Vietnam. The American troops were divided between black and white soldiers. The black soldiers were going to fight and they went home to America and didn't even have the vote. There was all sorts of class conflicts and racial conflicts taking place within the army. And at the end of the day, what happened was that the North Vietnamese army and the South Vietnamese rebel forces were able to inflict a massive defeat on the most powerful army in the world in Vietnam. Think about Iraq. I think you can see the same process unfolding there. In any simple terms of weighing up military might, Britain and America should wipe the floor with all the resistance movement in Iraq. And yet, from 2003 right up until the present, we see the continuing resistance, and in fact, you need to say that the resistance are winning. The Americans and the British are about to leave Iraq with their tail between their legs. And military size, that shouldn't happen, but it's about how you motivate people, what you're committed to. Are you fighting for liberation, or are you fighting for oppression? And it seems to me the same thing happened in 2006. That Israel, historically, had ideologically motivated troops who had lived through the Holocaust or who had family been through the Holocaust. We didn't want to see that again. That was the ideology of the Israeli state. That's how they motivated people, and they had therefore a well-armed and ideologically motivated fighting force. But by 2006, what they faced was two different things. First of all, Hezbollah were incredibly ideologically motivated. They were fighting for their freedom. They were fighting for the freedom of Lebanon from Israeli troops and bombardment around the south of Lebanon. So now the ideological place, if you like, was taken by Hezbollah. And the Israeli troops who were fighting were now second and third generation Israeli citizens who didn't have the same strong commitment to the state of Israel. And what you found was that resistance force of Hezbollah were able to deal with the might of the Israeli army and inflict an absolutely massive defeat on them in 2006. And the same, in a sense, has happened today. Israel went into Gaza saying that we will not finish this war until we have dealt with every single member of Hamas. We've smashed Hamas, smashed their networks, make sure that they can't come back from the dead. We will deal with their fighters, we will deal with their infrastructure. This is our project. After 3.5 weeks of the most brutal war in Gaza, they did not manage to do that. Under no circumstances can you say that Hamas have been smashed, and actually that means that the war in Israel seems to be a massive defeat for the state of Israel. Yet again, they could not deal with the Palestinian resistance, with the Islamic resistance, and with Hamas in that way. So now, of course, there's a huge question about Israel's position as the dominant imperial power in that region. They have now fought 2 wars in which they have not come out as the victor in any clear sense of the word. So that